I was organizing my morning pills when my brother-in-law Julian walked into my bedroom at midnight with legal papers. And that smile I should have recognized years ago. "Martha, the bank needs this signed tonight," he whispered, sliding the power of attorney across my bedside table. "Or they'll foreclose on your house by Friday." I stared at the document that would hand him control of everything I'd worked 40 years to build. My sister Sarah stood in the doorway, crying, too scared of her own husband to speak up for me. I reached for the pen with trembling fingers and smiled. "Of course, Julian. You've been so helpful to our family." He had no idea I'd already made a phone call that would destroy him. The grandfather clock chimed 12 times in the darkness. Each strike echoed through my Lincoln Park brownstone like a countdown to something Julian Torres couldn't see coming. I sat in my wheelchair beside the bedroom window, watching the snow fall on the same Chicago street where I'd lived for 30 years as a respected circuit court judge. The legal papers felt heavy in my lap. Power of attorney documents that would make Julian my financial guardian, give him access to every account, every investment, every cent I'd saved from 4 decades of judicial service. He thought he was so clever with his forged mortgage papers and his midnight ultimatums. But as I held that pen, I wasn't the confused elderly woman Julian believed me to be. I was still Judge Martha Richardson, and I'd just set a trap that would send him to prison for the rest of his life. The phone call I'd made 3 hours earlier was to Patricia Chen, the prosecutor who'd once been my court clerk. She was already on her way with arrest warrants. Tonight, Julian Torres was about to discover that some people never really retire from delivering justice. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now, let's get started. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Martha's Chicago brownstone, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors she had walked for 30 years. At 68, Martha Richardson moved through her Lincoln Park home with the precision of someone who had spent 4 decades commanding courtrooms. Her motorized wheelchair hummed softly as she navigated from the kitchen to her oak desk, where bills and correspondence waited in neat stacks. The pill organizer sat like a small fortress on the marble kitchen island. 7 compartments for 7 days, each divided into morning, noon, evening, and bedtime. Martha had arranged her medications with the same methodical care she once used to organize legal briefs. Blood pressure pills in the morning slot, pain medication for her arthritis at noon, heart medication in the evening compartment. Tuesday morning, she murmured, opening the correct compartment and swallowing the pills with a glass of water that had been sitting on the counter overnight. The sound of footsteps echoed from the front hallway. Julian's voice carried through the house, confident and familiar. "Morning, Martha. Sarah's running late today." Julian Torres had married Martha's younger sister 15 years ago, but his presence in the house still felt like an intrusion. At 51, he carried himself with the smooth confidence of someone who made his living convincing people to trust him with their money. His insurance brokerage had done well in the early years, or so he claimed. Martha's wheelchair moved toward the front door where Julian was sorting through the mail. The morning delivery lay scattered across the small table in the entryway: utility bills, advertisements, and a thick envelope bearing the Social Security Administration logo. "I'll take that," Martha said, reaching for the Social Security envelope. Julian's hand moved faster. His fingers wrapped around the envelope, lifting it away from her reach. "This looks official. Let me handle the bureaucracy for you." "Julian, I've been handling my own correspondence since before you were born." "Of course. But these government offices are complicated now. Everything's digital. Sarah worries about you dealing with all this paperwork." Martha's eyes narrowed. In her years on the bench, she had learned to recognize the subtle signs of deception. The way Julian's left hand fidgeted with his wedding ring. The slight elevation in his voice when he spoke about Sarah's concerns. "Leave it on the counter. I'll review it after breakfast." Already opened it. Just a standard adjustment notice. Nothing to worry about. But Martha had seen the envelope. The seal was intact when Julian picked it up. She watched him slip it into the inside pocket of his jacket, the same pocket where he kept his business cards. The morning routine continued, but something had shifted. Martha rolled her wheelchair to the sideboard where her Medicare card lay next to a small stack of medical appointment reminders. As she reached for the card, her fingers encountered something strange. A thin, sticky residue coated the plastic surface. She had been a circuit court judge for 40 years. She had presided over fraud cases, embezzlement trials, and elaborate schemes designed to separate vulnerable people from their money. She knew the anatomy of deception. Julian's voice drifted from the kitchen, casual and light. "I'll stop by the Social Security office this afternoon. Take care of whatever needs attention." Martha's fingers traced the edge of her Medicare card. The sticky residue felt like adhesive, as if someone had placed tape over the card's surface and then removed it. She thought about the envelope Julian had taken, about his explanation of digital bureaucracy, about Sarah's supposed concerns. Her wheelchair moved silently across the Persian rug toward the kitchen. Julian stood with his back to her, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was lower now, but she caught fragments of the conversation. By Friday, the payment should clear. She doesn't suspect. Martha stopped breathing. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire she couldn't yet see. Julian ended the call and turned around, his smile returning instantly. "Everything sorted. The office will send a confirmation letter in a few days." "What confirmation letter?" "For the payment adjustment. Standard procedure." Martha had spent decades listening to witnesses construct lies in real time. She recognized the pattern: vague details, confident delivery, and just enough truth to sound credible. "Julian, I'd like to see that Social Security letter." "Left it in the car." "I'll bring it in later." "Bring it now." For a moment, Julian's carefully maintained expression flickered. The smile remained, but his eyes went cold. "Martha, you're being paranoid. Sarah and I are trying to help you manage things. These government systems are confusing, even for smart people like you." The word paranoid landed like a slap. Martha had been called many things during her legal career: tough, fair, intimidating, but never paranoid. She was a woman who dealt in facts, evidence, and the careful construction of truth. "I want to see the letter." "I told you, it's in the car." "Then go get it." Julian's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the front door, then back at Martha. The silence stretched between them like a courtroom pause before a verdict. "Fine. But you're working yourself up over nothing." He walked toward the front door, his footsteps heavier than before. Martha listened to the sound of the door opening and closing, then wheeled quickly to the front window. Julian's Lexus sat in the driveway, but he wasn't walking toward it. Instead, he stood on the front porch, phone pressed to his ear again. Martha couldn't hear the words, but she could see his gestures: sharp, agitated movements that contradicted his earlier calm. She knew the law better than she knew her own heartbeat. She had built a career on identifying inconsistencies, on following the thread of deception until it led to truth. But this wasn't a courtroom. This was her home, her family, her daily life. The front door opened again. Julian's smile was back in place, but it looked rehearsed now. "Car's locked. I'll get the letter tomorrow when I'm near the office." "The Social Security office isn't near your insurance office, Julian. It's downtown. I have clients downtown." Another lie. Martha filed it away with the others: the unopened envelope, the sticky Medicare card, the phone conversation about payments and suspicion. Julian moved toward the kitchen, but Martha remained at the window. Outside, the Lincoln Park neighborhood was waking up. Dog walkers moved along the tree-lined sidewalks. Neighbors retrieved morning newspapers. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that inside the elegant brownstone at the corner, something was beginning to unravel. Martha's fingers found the armrest of her wheelchair. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, marked by the countless hours she had spent reviewing cases, making decisions, determining the difference between guilt and innocence. "Julian," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had once used to silence unruly courtrooms. "Leave the mail on the counter from now on." He turned around, and for just a moment, she saw past the mask. Behind the confident smile and practiced charm was something else, something calculating and cold. "Of course," he said. "Whatever makes you comfortable." But his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. Martha watched those hands, remembering how steady they had been when he took her Social Security letter. Steady hands that had grown unsteady only when she started asking questions. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but the light felt different now. Colder, more revealing. Martha sat in her wheelchair and began to plan her next move, the way she had planned her approach to every difficult case that had ever crossed her bench. Something was wrong in her house. Something that had been growing in the shadows while she focused on managing her pain and organizing her pills. But she was still a judge, still a woman who knew how to find the truth buried beneath layers of deception. The real question was how deep this deception went, and how much of her life had already been compromised while she wasn't paying attention. Outside, Julian's phone rang again. 3 days later, Martha's morning routine was interrupted by a knock at the front door. She rolled her wheelchair from the kitchen, where her pill organizer sat empty in the Tuesday morning compartment, to find a courier holding a certified envelope. Martha Richardson? Yes. Signature required. Martha signed the electronic pad and took the envelope. The return address made her stomach clench. First National Mortgage Services. She had been banking with First National for 20 years, and her mortgage had been paid off for 5 years. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper with bold red letters across the top: Final Notice of Default. This serves as final notice that your mortgage account number 447288392261 is 90 days past due. Amount owed $8,847.23. If payment is not received within 10 business days, foreclosure proceedings will begin. Martha read the notice 3 times. Each reading made less sense than the last. She had set up automatic payments 15 years ago. Every month, her bank account was debited for property taxes and homeowners insurance, but there had been no mortgage payment for years. She wheeled to her desk and opened the file drawer where she kept important documents. The mortgage satisfaction letter was exactly where it should be, dated August 15, 2019. Paid in full. The landline phone sat on the desk next to her computer. Martha dialed First National's customer service number. Nothing. She tried again, pressing each number carefully. Still nothing, not even a dial tone. Martha followed the phone cord from the base to the wall jack. Everything looked normal. She tried lifting the receiver again, pressing it firmly against her ear. Complete silence. Julian? She called toward the kitchen. No answer. Sarah's car wasn't in the driveway, and Julian's Lexus was gone too. Martha was alone in the house with a foreclosure notice and a dead phone. Her wheelchair moved down the hallway toward the basement door. The wooden steps were too steep for the chair, but Martha could reach the basement switch from the top of the stairs. The fluorescent lights flickered on, revealing the unfinished basement where the house's utilities were housed. Martha gripped the metal railing and carefully lowered herself down the first 3 steps until she could see the area where the phone lines entered the house. The main telephone cable hung loose from the junction box. The copper wires were exposed and clearly cut. Not damage, not accidentally disconnected, cut. Martha climbed back up the stairs slowly, her arthritis making each step painful. Someone had deliberately severed her connection to the outside world. She thought about the foreclosure notice, about Julian taking her Social Security letter, about the way he had dismissed her concerns as paranoia. The pieces were forming a picture she didn't want to see. Back in her bedroom, Martha opened the drawer of her nightstand. Hidden beneath old prescription bottles and reading glasses was a tablet. Computer, a gift from her grandson 3 Christmases ago that she had never bothered to learn how to use properly. The tablet's screen came to life when she touched it. After several attempts, she managed to connect to her wireless internet and navigate to First National's website. Her login information was saved in a small notebook she kept with her important papers. The account summary loaded slowly. Martha stared at the screen, reading each line carefully. Her checking account showed the same balance she expected. Her savings account was untouched. But there were 3 recent transfers she didn't recognize: electronic withdrawals of $2,782.41, $2,782.41, and $3,282.41. All 3 had been made to something called FN Mortgage Recovery. Martha had never authorized these transfers. She had never heard of FN Mortgage Recovery. The tablet screen began to hurt her eyes, but she continued scrolling through her account history. The withdrawals had started 6 weeks ago. Before that, her accounts showed normal activity: automatic deposits from her pension, automatic payments for utilities and insurance. Someone with access to her account information had been systematically draining her savings and calling it mortgage payments. Payments on a mortgage that had been satisfied years ago. Martha set the tablet aside and reached for her paper checkbook. She reconciled her account the old-fashioned way, line by line. The numbers confirmed what she had seen on the screen. Over the past 6 weeks, $8,847.23 had been withdrawn from her accounts without her authorization. Exactly the amount demanded in the foreclosure notice. The front door opened, and Sarah's voice echoed through the house. "Martha? I brought groceries." Sarah Torres looked older than her 55 years. Stress had carved lines around her eyes and mouth, and her brown hair was prematurely gray. She moved through the house with nervous energy, as if she were afraid of taking up too much space. "The phone isn't working," Martha said as Sarah unpacked groceries in the kitchen. "Really?" Julian didn't mention any problems. "Someone cut the line in the basement." Sarah's hands stopped moving. A can of soup remained suspended halfway between the grocery bag and the pantry shelf. Cut the line? The copper wires were exposed. This wasn't an accident. Maybe there was construction work. Or a repair issue. "Sarah, look at me." Sarah set down the soup can but didn't make eye contact. "Do you know anything about mortgage payments being taken from my account?" "Mortgage? Your house is paid off." "That's right. But someone has been making electronic transfers to something called FN Mortgage Recovery. Nearly $9,000 over the past 6 weeks. Sarah's face went pale. She gripped the edge of the kitchen counter as if she needed support to remain standing. "I don't. Julian handles the finances. I don't really understand." "What finances, Sarah?" "I handle my own finances." "He said you asked him to help." "With the complicated stuff. Online banking and electronic payments." Martha felt something cold settle in her chest. She had never asked Julian for financial help. She had been managing her own money since she was 18 years old. "When did I supposedly ask for this help?" "A few weeks ago. He said you were having trouble with the computer. That you wanted him to set up automatic payments." "I don't have automatic mortgage payments, Sarah. My mortgage was paid off 5 years ago." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She looked like a woman who was drowning but didn't know how to ask for help. "Maybe I misunderstood. Julian explains things, but sometimes I don't follow everything. Financial stuff confuses me." Martha studied her sister's face. Sarah had always been the emotional one, the sister who needed protection. But there was something else in her expression now, something that looked like guilt. "Where is Julian?" "At the office. He had appointments all day." "What kind of appointments?" "Insurance clients." "You know." But Martha didn't know. In the 15 years Julian had been married to Sarah, Martha had never met any of his clients. She had never been to his office. She realized she didn't even know the exact address of his business. "Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. Someone has been stealing money from my bank accounts. Someone cut my phone line to prevent me from contacting the bank. And now I've received a foreclosure notice on a mortgage that doesn't exist." You think Julian. "I think Julian has access to information he shouldn't have. I think he's been using that access to steal from me." Sarah began to cry quiet, defeated sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "I can't. I don't know what to do. He gets angry when I ask questions. He says I'm too emotional to understand business." "How long has this been happening, Sarah?" "I don't know. Maybe always. He controls everything. The bank accounts, the credit cards, even my phone plan. I don't have access to anything." Martha reached across the kitchen table and took her sister's hand. Sarah's fingers were cold and trembling. "We're going to figure this out. But first, we need to document everything. I need copies of my bank statements, and I need to contact the police." "The police?" "Martha, he's my husband. He's a thief, Sarah. And if we don't stop him, he's going to take everything." Sarah pulled her hand away and wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. "You don't understand. If he finds out I told you anything, what will he do, Sarah?" "I don't know. But he's different when he's angry. Really different." Martha had heard this kind of fear before, in her courtroom, from witnesses who were too scared to tell the truth. The fear of someone who had learned to live in survival mode. "Pack a bag," Martha said. "Stay here tonight." "I can't. He'll notice if I don't come home." "Then call him. Tell him you're helping me with something. Tell him I'm having medical problems." "He won't believe that." "Yes, he will. Because he wants you to believe I'm becoming helpless." It fits his story. Sarah looked toward the front door as if Julian might walk through it at any moment. I'm scared, Martha. I know, but I'm not helpless, and I'm not going to let him destroy our family. Martha's wheelchair moved toward the window overlooking the backyard. The evening was settling over Lincoln Park, and lights were beginning to come on in the neighboring houses. Normal families having normal dinners, unaware that in the house next door, a carefully constructed fraud was beginning to unravel. She thought about the foreclosure notice, the cut phone line, the unauthorized bank transfers. This wasn't random criminal activity. This was systematic, planned, and executed by someone who understood her routines and had access to her personal information. Someone who knew exactly where to cut the phone line. Someone who knew her banking habits. Someone who could explain away her questions and make her sister too afraid to ask for help. The silence in this house had become a predator. Martha stared at her reflection in the window glass, a 68-year-old woman in a wheelchair, supposedly vulnerable and isolated. But Julian had made one mistake. He had underestimated the woman who had spent 40 years exposing lies and holding people accountable for their crimes. I am not a victim yet, she whispered to the empty hallway. And in her voice was the authority of every verdict she had ever delivered. Sunday arrived with the crisp October air that made Lincoln Park feel like a postcard. Martha had spent the morning reviewing bank statements and photographing documents with her grandson's tablet. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion: Julian was systematically stealing her money while isolating her from anyone who might help. The St. Vincent de Paul Church fundraising gala was an annual tradition that brought together the neighborhood's established families. Martha had attended for 23 years, first as a sitting judge, then as a respected retiree. The event raised money for the parish's food pantry and provided an opportunity for the community's older residents to maintain their social connections. This year, Martha arrived with mixed feelings. She needed to maintain normal appearances while she investigated Julian's fraud, but she also hoped to find allies among her longtime neighbors. The church hall buzzed with conversation and the clink of coffee cups against saucers. Round tables covered with white tablecloths filled the room, each decorated with small arrangements of autumn flowers. Martha recognized most of the faces: retired teachers, former business owners, longtime parishioners who had raised their families in Lincoln Park. Martha, how wonderful to see you. Eleanor Fitzpatrick approached with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely missed seeing old friends. Eleanor had taught high school English for 40 years and possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that Martha respected. Eleanor, you look lovely. Thank you. How are you managing? Julian mentioned you've been having some difficulties. Martha's smile faltered slightly. Difficulties? Oh, you know, the usual challenges of aging. We all face them eventually. Before Martha could respond, Julian appeared at her elbow. He moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to working a room. His hand briefly touching Martha's shoulder in a gesture that might have appeared supportive to outside observers. Ladies, I hope you're discussing something more interesting than my sister-in-law's minor health concerns. Actually, Martha said, I was about to tell Eleanor about the fascinating legal case I've been following in the news. The Medicare fraud investigation in Detroit. Now Martha, Julian interrupted smoothly, I think you might be confusing that with one of your old case files. You mentioned the Detroit story to me last week, but that case was from your time on the bench. Ancient history. The correction was delivered with gentle humor, but Martha felt its impact like a physical blow. Around the table, she could see the subtle shift in expressions: the way Eleanor's eyes softened with concern, the way other conversations seemed to pause as people absorbed Julian's gentle correction of her supposedly failing memory. I'm quite certain the Detroit case is current news, Martha said firmly. Of course you are. Julian's tone remained kind, almost paternal. But sometimes our minds play tricks on us, don't they? Yesterday you insisted the Social Security office had sent you a letter. But when I checked with them directly, they had no record of any recent correspondence. Martha's hands tightened on the armrests of her wheelchair. Every word Julian spoke was carefully calculated to undermine her credibility while maintaining his image as a devoted family member. Perhaps we should change the subject, Eleanor suggested gently. Absolutely, Julian agreed. Martha's been under quite a bit of stress lately. Medical appointments, medication changes. It's a lot for anyone to handle. Father McKenna approached their table with the warm smile of a man who had spent 30 years providing comfort to his parishioners. "Martha, how are you feeling? Julian mentioned you've been having some challenges." The word challenges hung in the air like incense. Martha looked around the table and saw the familiar expression of well-meaning concern that people reserved for elderly neighbors who were beginning to slip away from themselves. "I'm feeling quite sharp, actually," Martha said. "In fact, I've been researching some interesting financial fraud cases. Did you know that family members are responsible for 90% of elder financial abuse?" The table went quiet. Julian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Martha," he said softly, "that's a very serious topic. Perhaps not appropriate for a social gathering." "I think it's extremely appropriate," Martha replied. "Especially since many of the people in this room are exactly the age group that fraudsters target." "Now you're scaring people," Julian said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Father McKenna, maybe you could help me convince my sister-in-law that church fundraisers aren't the place for crime statistics." Father McKenna looked uncomfortable. "Well, certainly we want everyone to feel safe. Of course," Julian continued. "But sometimes Martha gets focused on these dark topics. It's become a bit of an obsession lately. Sarah's worried that watching too much crime television isn't healthy." Martha felt the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest. She was a retired circuit court judge being dismissed like a confused elderly woman who watched too much television. "Julian," she said, her voice carrying the authority she had once used to silence unruly courtrooms. "I spent 40 years prosecuting fraud cases. I believe I'm qualified to discuss the subject." "Absolutely," Julian agreed quickly. "Your experience is invaluable. But that was then. These days, with the stress of managing your health issues." "What health issues? Martha, please. Let's not do this here." The conversation at nearby tables had stopped entirely. Martha could feel the weight of sympathetic stares, the kind of looks reserved for family members struggling with a relative's decline. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card that he handed to Father McKenna. "Tech Support Solutions," Julian explained. "Martha called them last week because she was having trouble with her computer. Unfortunately, it turned out to be one of those scam operations. They convinced her to give them remote access to her bank accounts." Martha stared at the business card. She had never seen it before, had never called any tech support company. But Julian presented it as evidence of her growing vulnerability to scams. "How much did they take?" Eleanor asked with genuine concern. "Not much," Julian said. "Sarah and I caught it quickly. But it was a wake-up call about how these criminals target older adults." "I never called any tech support company," Martha said firmly. "Martha, honey, we discussed this yesterday. You were trying to check your bank balance online and got frustrated with the password system." The endearment, honey, was perfectly calculated, affectionate enough to seem caring, condescending enough to infantilize her. "I have never had trouble with my online banking passwords." "Of course not," Julian soothed. "But sometimes when we're tired or stressed." "I am not tired or stressed. I am being defrauded by someone with access to my personal information." The silence that followed was deafening. Martha could see the pity in every face around the table, the same look she had seen countless times in her courtroom when family members struggled to accept a loved one's diminishing capacity. Julian placed his hand over Martha's with what appeared to be gentle compassion. "I think maybe we should head home," he said quietly. "This has been a long day. I'm not ready to leave." "I know. But Sarah's making dinner, and she worries when we're out too long." Martha looked around the table one more time. These were people who had known her for decades, who had respected her judgment and intelligence. Now they were looking at her with the careful kindness reserved for someone who could no longer be trusted to understand her own life. She gripped the wheels of her chair and propelled herself away from the table without another word. Behind her, she could hear Julian's voice, low and apologetic. "I'm sorry you had to see that. She's been having more episodes lately." Martha pushed through the church hall doors into the cool October air. The parking lot was filled with sensible cars, driven by responsible adults who managed their own affairs and were trusted to know the difference between reality and confusion. She sat in her wheelchair beside Julian's Lexus and waited. When he emerged from the church 10 minutes later, his expression was carefully neutral. That was unfortunate, he said as he helped her into the passenger seat. You humiliated me in front of my friends. I protected you from embarrassing yourself further. You made me look senile. Martha, you accused me of financial fraud in front of half the neighborhood. What was I supposed to do? The drive home passed in silence. Martha stared out the window at the familiar streets of Lincoln Park. Thinking about the faces around the table, about the carefully planted seeds of doubt in their expressions. Julian had done more than steal her money. He had stolen her reputation, her credibility, her standing in the community that had been her home for 3 decades. By the time they reached the brownstone, Martha understood the full scope of Julian's strategy. He wasn't just committing fraud, he was systematically destroying her ability to report it or resist it. Will you be all right? Julian asked as he helped her back into her wheelchair. Fine. Good. Sarah should be home soon. He walked to his car without looking back, leaving Martha alone on the front porch of her own house, feeling like a stranger in her own life. Inside, Martha moved to the front window and watched Julian's Lexus disappear down the tree-lined street. The shame of the afternoon still burned in her chest, but underneath it was something else, something sharper and more focused. Anger. She had been a judge of the circuit court for 40 years. She had commanded respect from attorneys, defendants, and colleagues who dealt with the most complex legal issues of their generation. She had never been anyone's victim, and she had never been anyone's fool. Martha gripped the armrest of her wheelchair and made a decision that would have been familiar to anyone who had ever stood in her courtroom. Julian Torres had declared war on her credibility, her independence, and her dignity. He had chosen to fight in public, using her age and her wheelchair as weapons against her. But he had underestimated the woman who had spent 40 years learning how to expose lies and hold criminals accountable for their actions. The heat rose in her cheeks as she remembered the priest patting her hand in pity. She forced a smile that felt like ice, but underneath it was the beginning of a plan. Julian wanted to play the role of the concerned family member protecting a confused elderly woman. He could play that role as long as he wanted. Right up until the moment she destroyed him. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight when Martha heard Julian's key in the front door. She had been awake for hours, sitting in her wheelchair beside her bedroom window, watching the street for his return. Sarah's Honda had been parked in the driveway since dinner, but Julian's Lexus had been missing until now. Footsteps moved through the house, first Julian's confident stride, then Sarah's lighter steps following behind. Their voices carried up the stairs, but the words were too muffled to understand. Martha could hear the tension in the rhythm of their conversation, the sharp edges of an argument being conducted in whispers. A door slammed somewhere downstairs. Then silence. Martha positioned her wheelchair near her bedroom door and waited. She had spent the evening preparing for this moment, gathering the documents she needed and hiding them where Julian wouldn't think to look. Her plan was simple: let him reveal himself completely, then strike back with evidence he couldn't dismiss or explain away. 20 minutes later, soft footsteps approached her door. A gentle knock, followed by Sarah's voice. "Martha? Are you awake? Come in." Sarah entered carrying a small tray with tea and what appeared to be official documents. Her eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled slightly as she set the tray on Martha's bedside table. "Julian needs to talk with you. About your finances. At midnight? He's been at the office all evening. Working on your case." "What case?" Sarah couldn't meet Martha's eyes. "The mortgage situation. The bank's threatening legal action." Martha felt her blood pressure rise, but she kept her voice calm. "Sarah, there is no mortgage situation. My house has been paid off for 5 years. That's what we thought too. But there's been some kind of mistake. Or maybe you forgot about a second mortgage?" The suggestion hung in the air like poison. Martha studied her sister's face and saw the careful construction of Julian's lie taking root in Sarah's desperate need to believe that her husband wasn't a criminal. "I have never taken a second mortgage on this house. Julian has the paperwork. He's been trying to straighten everything out, but the bank wants immediate payment." "How much?" $47,000. The number was absurd. Martha's house was worth perhaps $300,000, and she owned it outright. No legitimate lender would issue a second mortgage for that amount without extensive documentation and verification. "Sarah, look at me. Do you honestly believe I would take a $47,000 loan without telling anyone? I don't know what to believe anymore. Julian says that sometimes older people make financial decisions and then forget about them, especially when they're dealing with medication changes. Another carefully planted seed. Martha's arthritis medication had been adjusted recently, a routine change that Julian was now using to question her mental clarity. Where is this alleged mortgage paperwork? Downstairs with Julian. He's been waiting to discuss it with you. Martha understood the choreography of what was happening. Julian would present her with documents she had supposedly signed, contracts she had supposedly forgotten, and financial obligations she was supposedly responsible for meeting. Sarah would serve as both witness and unwitting accomplice, too frightened and confused to challenge her husband's version of events. Ask Julian to come up. Sarah left, and Martha heard whispered conversation downstairs, followed by Julian's footsteps on the stairs. He knocked once and entered without waiting for permission. Martha, I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but we have a serious situation that requires immediate attention. He carried a leather folder that he placed on the bed beside her wheelchair. Inside were documents that looked official: loan agreements, payment schedules, and bank statements she had never seen before. This is the second mortgage you took out in March, Julian explained, pointing to a signature at the bottom of the first page. Martha examined the signature carefully. It resembled her handwriting, but something was wrong with the formation of the letters. Too careful, too deliberate. I didn't sign this. Martha, I understand this is confusing. Memory issues are more common than people think, especially with the stress you've been under. I don't have memory issues. The bank says you called them personally to apply for this loan. They have records of multiple phone conversations. Show me the records. Julian flipped through the folder and produced a call log with dates and times. According to the document, Martha had initiated contact with the bank on March 15 and had several follow-up conversations over the course of 2 weeks. March 15 was my birthday. I spent the entire day with my grandson. We went to the Art Institute and had dinner at the Purple Pig. I never called any bank. Martha, honey, your birthday is March 12th. March 15th was a Wednesday. The correction was delivered gently, but it struck Martha like a physical blow. For a moment, she doubted herself. Was her birthday the 12th or the 15th? The confusion lasted only seconds, but Julian saw it register in her expression. It's okay, he said softly. This is why Sarah and I are here to help you sort through these things. Martha forced herself to focus. Her birthday was March 12th. She was certain of it. Julian was using minor confusion to undermine her confidence in her own memory. These documents are forged. Martha, that's a very serious accusation. Are you saying that First National Bank is committing fraud? I'm saying someone with access to my personal information forged these documents and impersonated me to the bank. Julian's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Who would do something like that? You tell me. The silence that followed was electric. Julian closed the folder and set it aside, his movement deliberate and controlled. Martha, I'm going to be very direct with you. The bank has given us 10 days to bring this account current. If we can't make the payment, they will begin foreclosure proceedings. Let them. When they discover that this loan doesn't actually exist, they'll withdraw their claim. But what if you're wrong? What if this confusion is part of a larger pattern? What if the stress of managing your health issues has affected your memory more than you realize? My health issues don't affect my memory. Last week you accused me of stealing your Social Security letter. But when I called the office, they confirmed that no letter had been sent. Yesterday you insisted that someone had cut your phone line, but the repair technician found a loose connection that had worked itself free over time. Martha stared at him. Every lie was delivered with perfect sincerity, supported by just enough detail to sound credible. The phone line was cut. Martha, I was there when the technician explained the problem. Age deteriorates connections. It's completely normal. Show me the repair report. Of course. Julian reached into his jacket and produced a work order from Illinois Bell. The form showed a routine service call for a loose connection, completed the day after Martha had discovered the severed wire. The repair report was as fake as everything else Julian had presented, but it looked authentic enough to convince someone who wanted to believe it. The bank needs an answer tonight, Julian continued. We can either make arrangements to pay the loan, or we can accept that your financial affairs have become too complex for you to manage independently. What does that mean? It means transferring authority for your financial decisions to someone who can handle them responsibly. Julian placed another document on the bed, a power of attorney form with Martha's name already typed in the appropriate spaces. This would allow Sarah and me to work directly with the bank to resolve this situation. To protect your house and your savings from any further complications. Martha understood now that she was looking at the endgame of Julian's strategy. The forged mortgage created a crisis that only he could solve, but only if she surrendered control of her finances to him. And if I refuse to sign? Then the bank will foreclose on your house. You'll lose everything you've worked for, and you'll face possible criminal charges for defaulting on a legitimate loan. The loan isn't legitimate. Can you prove that in court? With your memory issues and the stress you've been under? The threat was clear. Julian was betting that she wouldn't be able to convince a judge or jury that she hadn't signed the mortgage documents. Especially after he had spent weeks establishing a pattern of confusion and forgetfulness. Sarah spoke from the doorway, where she had been standing silently. Martha, please, just sign the papers. Julian knows how to handle these things. Sarah, he's committing fraud. He's trying to save your house. Sarah began to cry, desperate, exhausted sobs that filled the room with the sound of a woman who had been pushed beyond her breaking point. I can't do this anymore, Sarah wept. I can't watch everything fall apart. Please, just let him help us. Martha looked at her sister and saw what Julian's manipulation had accomplished. Sarah was no longer capable of distinguishing between help and harm, between protection and exploitation. What happens if I sign this? We resolve the mortgage situation, Julian said. We establish a proper system for managing your financial affairs. And we make sure this kind of confusion doesn't happen again. And if I don't sign? The sheriff will be here within 2 weeks to serve eviction papers. Martha stared at the power of attorney document. The signature line waited for her decision: surrender her independence voluntarily, or fight a battle she might not be able to win. She thought about the church fundraiser, about the pitying looks of her neighbors, about the carefully constructed evidence Julian had presented to make her appear confused and unreliable. Give me the pen. Julian handed her a black ballpoint pen, his expression carefully neutral. Martha took the pen and held it above the signature line. For 40 years, she had signed legal documents with the authority of her judicial office behind her. Now she was signing away that authority, admitting that she was no longer competent to manage her own affairs. The pen touched the paper, and Martha began to write her name in the careful script she had used to sign thousands of court orders and legal decisions. But as she formed the letters, something changed in her expression. The defeat in her eyes was replaced by something sharper, more calculating. This is how my story ends, she thought. Trapped in a room I paid for with 40 years of service. The shadows on the wall looked like bars, and the sound of her pen against paper sounded like the closing of a cell door. But Julian had made one crucial mistake. He had assumed that signing this document would be Martha's surrender. Instead, it would be the beginning of his destruction. She finished writing her name and set the pen aside. Julian reached for the document, but Martha's hand covered it first. Before you file this, she said quietly, I want one thing. What's that? I want to see my grandson one more time. To explain what's happening, Martha, family visits might be confusing right now. One dinner. This weekend. Then you can proceed with whatever arrangements you think are necessary. Julian nodded slowly. Of course. Family is important. But Martha was already thinking about the dinner conversation she would have with her grandson, the conversation that would include every document she had photographed, every lie Julian had told, and every piece of evidence she had hidden where he would never think to look. The pen trembled not with age, but with the sheer weight of despair that was already transforming into something far more dangerous. Thank you for understanding, she said to Julian, her voice barely above a whisper. But behind her eyes was the beginning of a plan that would turn his own methods against him. Martha sat in the pre-dawn darkness of her bedroom, the power of attorney document lying on her nightstand like evidence of her own defeat. Sleep had been impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Julian's satisfied expression as he tucked the signed papers into his leather folder. But there was something else competing with her exhaustion, a memory that had been struggling to surface since the moment she had signed her name. Something about the way Julian's left eye had twitched when he explained the mortgage documents. Something familiar. Martha's wheelchair moved silently through the house toward the basement door. She needed to retrieve something from the old filing cabinet, where she kept her court records, something that might help her understand why Julian's behavior seemed so familiar. The basement steps were impossible for her wheelchair, but Martha could reach the light switch and see into the storage area. There, behind old Christmas decorations and her late husband's golf clubs, stood the metal filing cabinet that contained 30 years of case files. She had kept only the most significant cases, the ones that had taught her something important about human nature or legal procedure. Somewhere in those files was a case from 1995, a fraud trial that had lasted 6 weeks and changed how she thought about deception. Martha called to Sarah, whose bedroom was directly above the basement. "Sarah, I need help with something." Footsteps moved across the floor upstairs, and Sarah appeared at the top of the basement stairs in her bathrobe. Her eyes were still puffy from crying. "What do you need?" "There's a file I need from the basement cabinet. A case from 1995. People vs. Henderson." "Martha, it's 5 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Please, it's important." Sarah made her way carefully down the wooden steps and located the filing cabinet. The Henderson case was in the third drawer, exactly where Martha remembered leaving it. The file was thick, filled with depositions, financial records, and photographs of forged documents. Marcus Henderson had been a respected insurance broker who had systematically defrauded elderly clients over a period of 3 years. He had used their trust in his professional expertise to gain access to their financial information, then created fictitious policies and investment opportunities to steal their savings. Martha opened the file and began reading her own handwritten notes from the trial. Henderson's methodology was sophisticated. He never stole large amounts at once, preferring to take small sums that might go unnoticed. He isolated his victims by convincing their families that they were becoming confused and unreliable. He created paperwork that looked legitimate but contained subtle forgeries that only an expert could detect. Most importantly, Henderson had a small physical habit that gave him away when he was constructing a lie in real time. His left eye twitched almost imperceptibly when he was under stress, the same twitch Martha had seen in Julian's eye the night before. She turned to the section of the file that contained Drive. Patricia Wong's expert testimony about the psychology of elder financial abuse. Dr. Wong had explained that perpetrators often followed a predictable pattern first. They established themselves as helpful and trustworthy, then they gradually isolated their victims from other sources of support. Finally, they created artificial crises that could only be resolved by transferring financial control to the perpetrator. Martha read through her own notes from Dr. Wong's testimony, remembering how clearly the psychologist had explained the methodology of financial predators. They don't see themselves as criminals, Drive. Wong had testified. They see themselves as problem solvers. They create problems that only they can solve, and they genuinely believe they're helping their victims by taking control of complex situations. The Henderson case had ended with a conviction and a 12-year prison sentence. But Marcus Henderson had been a stranger who targeted random elderly clients. Julian was family, which made his fraud both more personal and more devastating. Martha closed the file and looked up at Sarah, who had been waiting silently at the bottom of the stairs. "Sarah, do you remember what Julian did for work before he married you?" "Insurance." "You know that. What kind of insurance?" "Life insurance, health insurance, all kinds." "Did he work for a company, or was he independent?" Sarah's forehead creased with concentration. I think he worked for different companies. He changed jobs a few times before we got married." "Do you remember the names of any of the companies?" "Why does it matter?" "Because I think Julian has done this before." Martha's wheelchair moved toward the bottom of the stairs, where she could look directly at her sister's face. "Sarah, I need you to think carefully. In the 15 years you've been married to Julian, have you ever met any of his clients? Have you ever been to his office? Have you ever seen his insurance license or his business records?" Sarah's face went pale. He keeps work and home separate. He says it's better that way." "When was the last time you saw a pay stub from his insurance business?" I don't handle the finances. Julian says I'm not good with numbers. But you must see some evidence of his income. Bank deposits, tax returns, business correspondence. Sarah sat down heavily on the basement steps, her bathrobe pulling tight around her thin frame. I don't see any of that. Julian handles everything. He gives me cash for groceries and household expenses, but I don't have access to bank accounts or credit cards. Martha felt the pieces of Julian's deception clicking into place with the precision of a well-constructed legal argument. He had isolated Sarah financially just as he was now isolating Martha. He had convinced his wife that she was too emotional and confused to understand business. The same way he was now convincing everyone that Martha was too old and unreliable to manage her own affairs. Sarah, when Julian first started helping you with finances, did small amounts of money go missing? Bills that you thought were paid, but turned out to be overdue? Credit card charges that you couldn't remember making? Sarah's hands began to tremble. How did you know? Because he's following a pattern. The same pattern that criminals have used for decades to steal from people they're supposed to protect. Julian's not a criminal. He's controlling. Some men are controlling. Some men steal money and forge documents and cut phone lines to cover their tracks. Sarah began to cry again, but this time her tears had a different quality, not the desperate sobs of the night before, but the quiet weeping of someone who was finally acknowledging a truth she had been afraid to face. I've been so stupid. You haven't been stupid. You've been manipulated by someone who understands exactly how to exploit trust and affection. Martha thought about the power of attorney document upstairs, about Julian's satisfied expression, about the way he had constructed each step of his fraud. With the patience of someone who had practiced these techniques before. But she also thought about the Henderson case, about how Marcus Henderson's arrogance had ultimately led to his downfall. He had been so confident in his ability to manipulate the legal system that he had left evidence of his crimes scattered throughout his business records. Martha had a feeling that Julian had made similar mistakes. Sarah, I need you to help me with something. What? I need you to find out everything you can about Julian's business. His office address, his insurance license number, his client list. Everything. He'll be angry if he finds out. He's going to be angry anyway. The question is whether we're going to stop him before he steals everything we have, or whether we're going to let him destroy both of our lives. Sarah wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her bathrobe. When she looked up, Martha saw something in her expression that hadn't been there. The night before, a spark of the intelligence and determination that had been buried under years of psychological manipulation. What do you need me to do? Martha opened the Henderson file again and pointed to Dr. Wong's testimony about the psychology of financial predators. First, we document everything. Every lie he's told, every document he's forged, every time he's isolated us from sources of help. Then what? Then we turn his own methods against him. Martha's voice carried an echo of the authority she had once wielded in her courtroom, the voice of someone who had spent 40 years learning how to expose lies and hold criminals accountable for their actions. The memory of the courtroom air, thick with the scent of old paper and the weight of justice, filled her lungs for the first time in months. Sarah helped Martha back to the main floor, carrying the Henderson file carefully. As they moved through the quiet house, Martha felt something shifting inside her, the transformation from victim back to judge. Julian had underestimated the woman who had built a career on understanding criminal behavior. He had assumed that age and isolation would make her helpless, that the wheelchair and the pill organizer would define her capabilities. But Martha Richardson was still the judge who had presided over hundreds of fraud cases. She still understood the law better than most attorneys. And she had just remembered something that Julian had no way of knowing about her. She had never lost a case against a financial predator. I am still the judge, she said quietly to herself as the morning light began to filter through the windows of her Lincoln Park home. And for the first time since this nightmare had begun, the trembling in her hands stopped completely. Martha spent the next 3 days playing the role Julian expected, a confused elderly woman gradually accepting her need for help. She asked simple questions about her medications, expressed gratitude for his financial guidance, and apologized for causing trouble at the church fundraiser. The performance was perfect because it was based on careful observation of how Julian wanted her to behave. Every time she acted slightly confused or overwhelmed, she could see the satisfaction in his expression. Every time she deferred to his judgment, he relaxed a little more. But while Julian was enjoying his apparent victory, Martha was methodically destroying the foundation of his fraud. She started with her grandson's tablet, which Julian had no idea she possessed. Late at night, while the house was quiet, she researched Illinois insurance regulations and financial fraud statutes. She also searched for Marcus Henderson, the insurance broker from her 1995 case. What she discovered was both illuminating and disturbing. Marcus Henderson had been released from prison in 2009 after serving 14 years of his sentence. 6 months later, a man named Julian Torres had applied for an Illinois insurance license, using an address in Henderson's former neighborhood. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Martha printed the documents using the small printer she kept in her bedroom closet. Each page of evidence went into a manila folder that she hid beneath the legal papers Julian thought he controlled. The second phase of her investigation required Sarah's help, and Sarah's newfound determination to uncover the truth. "His office is at 1247 West Madison," Sarah reported after following Julian one afternoon. "But when I went inside, the directory didn't list Torres Insurance. The suite number he gave me belongs to a copy center. What about clients? Have you ever seen him meet with any clients? Never at the house. And when I call his office number, it goes straight to voicemail." Martha absorbed this information while maintaining her facade of growing dependence. During dinner conversations, she allowed Julian to explain banking procedures and insurance policies as if she were hearing about them for the first time. She asked him to help her understand her own financial statements, giving him opportunities to dig himself deeper into his web of lies. "The mortgage situation is more complicated than we initially thought," Julian announced during one such conversation. "The bank is requiring additional documentation." "What kind of documentation?" "They need verification of your income sources. Pension statements, social security records, investment portfolios." Martha nodded agreeably. Of course. Whatever they need. But she was thinking about the careful construction of Julian's trap. He was systematically gathering the documentation he needed to forge additional financial instruments in her name. "I'll need to make copies of everything for their files," Julian continued. "You're so helpful. I don't know what Sarah and I would do without you." The compliment made Julian visibly relax. He was so confident in his control over the situation that he had stopped being cautious about what he said in front of Martha. That night, after Julian and Sarah had gone to bed, Martha implemented the third phase of her plan. She positioned her pill organizer at the edge of her desk so that it concealed a micro camera that her grandson had given her for video calls. The camera was small enough to be invisible but powerful enough to record everything that happened at the desk where Julian conducted his document forgery. Martha tested the camera's angle and range, making sure it would capture both Julian's hands and his face when he worked at the desk. Then she placed a few of her financial documents in obvious locations where Julian would be tempted to examine them. The next morning, Julian took the bait. "Martha, I noticed some discrepancies in your investment statements," he said, settling down at her desk with a stack of papers. "Let me verify a few details with the bank." From her position by the window, Martha could see Julian's reflection in her computer screen. He was using a pen to trace over her signature on several documents, practicing the formation of her letters. Then he took out a separate sheet of paper and began copying her signature repeatedly, adjusting the pressure and angle until the forgeries looked authentic. The micro camera captured everything. Julian's phone calls were equally revealing. He spoke to someone at what he claimed was First National Mortgage Services. But his side of the conversation made it clear that he was talking to an accomplice, not a bank representative. The additional authorization should be ready by Friday. Yes, the full amount. She signed willingly. No complications with the sister. Martha's hands gripped the armrests of her wheelchair as she listened to Julian discuss her financial destruction as if it were a routine business transaction. But the most damaging evidence came from Julian's laptop, which he left open on Martha's desk while he took a phone call in the kitchen. Martha had exactly 3 minutes to access the computer before Julian returned. Her arthritis made typing painful, but she managed to navigate to Julian's email account, which was still logged in from his morning correspondence. What she found there exceeded her worst expectations. Julian's email history revealed communications with a network of accomplices who specialized in elder financial abuse. There were template documents for forging mortgage papers, instructions for impersonating bank officials, and detailed profiles of potential victims including Martha. Her own profile was particularly thorough. Julian had been studying her routines, her medical conditions, her family relationships, and her financial assets for more than a year. He knew about her arthritis medications, her wheelchair dependency, her isolation from former colleagues, and her complicated relationship with Sarah. Most disturbing of all, Martha wasn't Julian's first victim. The email history contained references to at least 6 other elderly individuals whose financial affairs Julian had taken control of through similar methods. In each case, he had used forged documents and manufactured crises to convince family members that their relative was no longer capable of independent financial management. Martha quickly copied the most incriminating emails to her grandson's tablet, then returned Julian's laptop to its original position just as his footsteps approached the desk. "Sorry about that," Julian said, closing the laptop. "Bank business, of course." But Martha was no longer listening to Julian's explanations. She was thinking about the 6 other victims whose lives he had destroyed while perfecting his techniques. That afternoon, while Julian was supposedly at the office, Martha contacted the Cook County Prosecutor's Office using the tablet's internet connection. She requested to speak with Patricia Chen, a former clerk from Martha's courtroom who was now a prosecutor specializing in elder financial abuse. "Judge Richardson? I haven't heard from you in years. How are you? I'm dealing with a situation that requires immediate legal intervention. Can you meet with me privately? It's about an active fraud case." "Of course. When and where?" "Tomorrow evening. My house." "And Patricia?" "Come prepared to make arrests." Martha spent that evening organizing her evidence into the kind of comprehensive case file she had once prepared for major criminal trials. Every forged document, every incriminating email, every recorded conversation was cataloged and cross-referenced. She also prepared a second document, a detailed statement explaining Julian's methodology and identifying the other victims, whose cases would need to be investigated. By midnight, Martha had assembled a case that would have impressed any prosecutor she had ever worked with. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was thorough, and the legal arguments were bulletproof. But more importantly, Martha had rediscovered something: that Julian's manipulation had temporarily obscured her own competence, intelligence, and authority. She was no longer the confused elderly woman who had signed the power of attorney document 3 nights earlier. She was Judge Martha Richardson, and she was about to deliver a verdict that would destroy the man who had tried to steal her life. The calm before the storm settled over her Lincoln Park brownstone like morning mist. Martha sat in her wheelchair, surrounded by the evidence of Julian's crimes, and felt the familiar sensation she had experienced countless times in her courtroom. The moment when justice was about to be served. Friday morning arrived with the crisp November air that reminded Martha of the day she had first been sworn in as a circuit court judge 43 years earlier. She woke before dawn, moved through her morning routine with military precision, and positioned herself at the front window to watch for Patricia Chen's arrival. Julian's Lexus had been in the driveway since the night before, but the house was unusually quiet. Sarah hadn't emerged from her bedroom, and Julian hadn't appeared for his usual morning inspection of Martha's mail. At exactly 9 o'clock, Patricia Chen's unmarked police car turned onto the tree-lined street, followed by 2 additional vehicles that Martha recognized as belonging to the Cook County Sheriff's Office. Martha's phone, a prepaid device Patricia had provided the day before, buzzed with a text message: "In position. Ready to proceed." Martha typed her response with deliberate care: "Send them in." The doorbell rang once, followed by Julian's hurried footsteps down the stairs. Martha could hear him checking his appearance in the hallway mirror before opening the door. "Yes, Mr. Torres? I'm Patricia Chen with the Cook County Prosecutor's Office. We have a warrant to search these premises and arrest you on charges of elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and identity theft." The silence that followed was absolute. Martha imagined Julian's expression as he processed the words that meant the end of his carefully constructed deception. There must be some mistake. "I'm Julian Torres. I live here with my wife and mother-in-law. I haven't committed any crimes. Sir, please step outside and place your hands behind your back. This is insane. I want to call my lawyer. You'll have that opportunity at the station. Right now, I need you to comply with the arrest. Martha heard the metallic click of handcuffs, followed by the recitation of Julian's rights. The sound was both familiar and satisfying. She had heard the same process thousands of times in her courtroom, but never with such personal investment in the outcome. Patricia's voice carried into the house as she addressed the other officers. Secure the premises. The warrant covers all financial documents, computers, and communication devices. Martha wheeled to the front door, where she could see Julian being placed in the back of a police car. His face was visible through the window, no longer the confident insurance broker who had manipulated her family for months, but a common criminal facing the consequences of his choices. Patricia Chen approached Martha with the respectful familiarity of someone who had learned the law under Martha's supervision. Judge Richardson, thank you for bringing this to our attention. The evidence you provided gave us everything we needed for the warrant. How extensive is the investigation? Based on his computer records, we've identified 14 potential victims across 3 states. Julian Torres, whose real name is Marcus Henderson, has been running this operation for 8 years. The confirmation of Martha's suspicions brought her no satisfaction. She felt only sadness for the other families who had been destroyed by the man she had trusted with her sister's welfare. What about Sarah? We'll need to interview her, but based on your statement, she appears to be another victim rather than an accomplice. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, moving like someone in shock. Her face was pale, and she seemed to have trouble understanding what was happening around her. Martha? What's going on? Why are there police officers in our house? Sarah, Julian has been arrested for financial fraud. The man you married has been systematically stealing money from elderly victims for nearly a decade. That's impossible. Julian sells insurance. Patricia stepped forward with the gentle authority of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to victims' families. Ma'am, your husband never held a valid insurance license in Illinois. His business was a front operation for elder financial abuse. Sarah looked toward the police car where Julian sat handcuffed in the back seat. Even from a distance, Martha could see the moment when reality finally broke through the years of manipulation and gaslighting. He told me, Sarah began, then stopped. He said Martha was getting confused, that she needed help managing her finances. That's part of his methodology, Patricia explained. He isolates victims by convincing family members that their relative is becoming incompetent. It makes the family complicit in the financial abuse while giving them plausible deniability. One of the investigators emerged from the house carrying Julian's laptop and a box of financial documents. We found everything, he told Patricia. Forged mortgage papers, fake bank statements, correspondence with a network of accomplices. This is one of the most comprehensive elder fraud operations we've ever seen. Patricia turned back to Martha. Judge Richardson, the evidence you gathered was exceptional. The video recordings of document forgery, the copied emails, the detailed timeline of his activities, it's exactly what we need to ensure conviction. What happens now? Julian Torres will be charged under both state and federal statutes. Given the scope of his operation and the number of victims involved, he's looking at 20 to 30 years in federal prison. Martha absorbed this information with the satisfaction of someone who had spent a career ensuring that justice was served appropriately. But there was still one more conversation she needed to have. The investigators spent the rest of the morning documenting Julian's crimes and interviewing Sarah about her own experiences as a victim of his manipulation. By afternoon, the house was quiet again, but it felt different, cleaner somehow, as if a poison had been drained from the air. Martha found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. I'm sorry, Sarah said without looking up. I let him convince me that you were losing your mind. I should have known better. Sarah, you were being manipulated by someone who had 15 years to perfect his techniques. You're not responsible for his crimes. But I helped him. I brought him those papers to sign. I told him about your daily routines, your medical appointments, your financial habits. You were trying to help me. Julian exploited that good intention. Sarah began to cry, not the desperate sobs of recent weeks, but the quiet tears of someone grieving for time lost and trust betrayed. What do I do now? I don't have access to any bank accounts. I don't have credit cards. I don't even know how much money we have or where we live. Martha reached across the table and took her sister's hand. You stay here. We figure out your financial situation together. And we start rebuilding our relationship based on truth instead of manipulation. He said you didn't want me around. That you found me annoying and emotional. He lied. You're my sister. You've always been welcome in this house. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating two women who had both survived an assault on their independence and dignity. Martha felt the familiar satisfaction of a case successfully concluded, but also the deeper contentment of family bonds restored. Patricia Chen returned that evening with updates on the investigation. Julian's network is more extensive than we initially realized, she reported. We've arrested 3 accomplices and identified 21 victims across 5 states. Your case provided the breakthrough evidence we needed to dismantle the entire operation. What about restitution for the victims? We've frozen Julian's assets and located several offshore accounts where he was hiding stolen funds. Most victims should recover a significant portion of their losses. Martha nodded with approval. Justice required not only punishment for criminals, but restoration for their victims. Judge Richardson, Patricia continued, I have to ask, how did you maintain such detailed documentation while he was actively manipulating your circumstances? I remembered something Julian couldn't have known about me, Martha replied. I've never lost a case against a financial predator. Patricia smiled with the admiration of someone who understood the dedication required to build such a record. Would you be willing to testify as an expert witness in the other victims' cases? Your experience with elder financial abuse could help ensure convictions. Martha considered the request. For months, she had felt like her professional expertise was a relic of the past, irrelevant to her current circumstances. Julian had tried to convince her that age and physical limitations had diminished her capabilities. But the past week had proven that her legal knowledge, investigative skills, and understanding of criminal behavior were as sharp as ever. I'd be honored to help, Martha said. As Patricia packed up her files and prepared to leave, Martha looked around her Lincoln Park. Brownstone, the house she had almost lost to Julian's fraud, the home she had nearly signed away in defeat. Tonight, the house felt like her own again. The shadows no longer seemed threatening, and the silence no longer felt isolating. Julian Torres was in custody, facing the full weight of the legal system he had tried to manipulate. The other victims would have their chance at justice and restitution. And Martha Richardson had rediscovered something that months of manipulation had temporarily obscured: her own competence, authority, and undiminished capacity for ensuring that criminals faced the consequences of their actions. Today, the law returned to this house, she said quietly to herself as the investigators' cars disappeared down the tree-lined street. And it found you guilty before I even spoke a word. 6 months later, Martha's Lincoln Park brownstone had transformed into something she had never imagined during her years on the bench. The front parlor, which had once been a formal sitting room used mainly for holidays, now housed a small legal clinic specializing in elder financial protection. 3 mornings a week, Martha met with seniors who suspected they were being victimized by financial fraud. Her wheelchair was positioned behind an oak desk where she reviewed suspicious documents, analyzed questionable contracts, and provided guidance to people whose trust had been exploited by criminals who understood how to manipulate age-related vulnerabilities. Mrs. Kowalski, this investment opportunity your nephew described doesn't exist, Martha explained to her current client, a 74-year-old widow who had been pressured to liquidate her pension. These are the hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme. Eleanor Kowalski gripped her purse with white knuckles. But Robert is family. He wouldn't steal from me. Family members are responsible for 90% of elder financial abuse, Martha said gently. The people who have access to our personal information are often the same people who exploit that access. Martha's reputation for exposing financial fraud had spread throughout the Lincoln Park community and beyond. Local attorneys referred clients to her clinic, and the Cook County Prosecutor's Office regularly consulted with her on complex elder abuse cases. The satisfaction of this work exceeded anything Martha had experienced during her years on the bench. She was no longer just adjudicating. Disputes, she was preventing them by educating potential victims before they lost their life savings to sophisticated criminals. Sarah had proven to be an invaluable partner in the clinic's daily operations. Her own experience as a victim of Julian's manipulation gave her unique insight into the psychological tactics used by financial predators. She had become the clinic's primary counselor for family members who struggled with guilt and confusion after discovering that a trusted relative had been stealing from them. "The most important thing to remember," Sarah told Mrs. Kowalski, "is that you're not responsible for someone else's decision to commit fraud against you. Trust is not a weakness." Sarah's recovery from 15 years of psychological manipulation had been gradual but steady. The couple's counseling she and Martha had undertaken together had helped both sisters understand how Julian's systematic gaslighting had distorted their relationship and undermined their confidence in their own perceptions. Martha had also discovered that Sarah was far more intelligent and capable than Julian's manipulation had allowed her to demonstrate. Given the opportunity to manage the clinic's financial records and client scheduling, Sarah had proven to be both organized and insightful. "Sarah, what's our schedule for Thursday?" 3 appointments. The Morrison family wants to discuss their father's reverse mortgage situation. Mrs. Chen is bringing documentation about her son's suspicious investment advice. And Detective Rodriguez wants to consult about the Patterson case. Martha smiled at the easy competence in Sarah's voice, so different from the fearful, confused woman who had delivered forged documents to Martha's bedroom 6 months earlier. The legal clinic occupied only part of Martha's transformation. She had also begun teaching a monthly seminar at the Chicago Public Library about financial protection for seniors. Her classes were consistently oversubscribed, drawing attendees from throughout the metropolitan area who wanted to learn how to protect themselves and their families from elder financial abuse. "The most dangerous phrase in elder fraud is, 'Let me handle this for you,'" Martha told her most recent class. When someone offers to manage your finances, your first question should be, "Why?" Your second question should be, "Show me your credentials." Your third question should be, "What oversight will there be?" The teaching reminded Martha of the satisfaction she had felt during her judicial career, when she could educate attorneys about legal procedure and help them become more effective advocates for their clients. But perhaps the most meaningful change in Martha's life was the restoration of her relationship with her family. Her grandson visited regularly, not just for obligatory holiday dinners, but for genuine conversation about law, technology, and the intersection of justice and social service. "Grandma, have you thought about expanding the clinic? Maybe training other retired judges to do what you're doing?" "It's an interesting idea. There are certainly enough victims to justify multiple clinics, and enough retired judges who might want to use their expertise for community service." Martha considered her grandson's suggestion. During her 6 months of clinic work, she had been contacted by former colleagues who were interested in applying their legal knowledge to elder protection advocacy. The demand for services far exceeded what one small clinic could provide. "What would you think about helping me research the requirements for establishing a nonprofit organization?" Her grandson's face lit up with enthusiasm. "I'd love that. We could create a website, develop training materials, maybe even write grants to fund expansion." The conversation reflected a family dynamic that Julian had never been able to destroy. Despite his systematic attempts to isolate Martha from sources of support and affection. In the evening, after the clinic had closed and Sarah had gone to her apartment, she now maintained her own residence, with her own bank accounts and credit cards. Martha often sat in her front window and reflected on the path that had brought her from victim to advocate. Julian Torres, whose real name was Marcus Henderson, had been sentenced to 32 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to charges involving 28 victims and more than $1.2 million in stolen assets. The network of accomplices who had enabled his operation had received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. Most importantly, the victims of Julian's fraud had recovered approximately 80% of their stolen funds through asset forfeiture and restitution orders. The money couldn't undo the psychological damage of betrayed trust, but it provided financial security that many victims had thought was lost forever. Martha had testified as an expert witness in 6 of the related cases, helping prosecutors explain the sophisticated methodology that financial predators used to manipulate their victims. Her testimony had been crucial in securing convictions against criminals who might otherwise have successfully claimed that their victims had willingly participated in the financial transactions. On this particular evening, as Chicago's winter settled over Lincoln Park with its familiar mixture of beauty and harshness, Martha found herself thinking about resilience and recovery. 6 months ago, she had been an isolated woman whose independence was gradually being stripped away by someone she trusted. Her confidence in her own judgment had been systematically undermined, and her connections to the outside world had been severed by a criminal who understood that isolation was the most effective tool for maintaining control over victims. But that experience had also reconnected her with skills and knowledge that retirement had left dormant. The investigative abilities she had developed during 40 years of legal practice, the understanding of criminal behavior that had made her an effective judge, and the passion for justice that had motivated her entire career, all of these had been reawakened by her confrontation with Julian's fraud. Martha's cell phone rang, interrupting her meditation. The caller ID showed Patricia Chen's number. "Judge Richardson? I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to update you on something important." "What's happened?" "We just arrested 3 more members of Henderson's network. Apparently, he continued directing operations from prison using contraband communication devices. But here's the interesting part: 2 of the new victims contacted us directly after attending your library seminars. They recognized the manipulation tactics you described and reported the fraud before losing any money." Martha felt the deep satisfaction that had always accompanied successful prevention of criminal activity. That's exactly why education is so important. People can protect themselves if they know what to look for. "Judge Richardson, I have to ask, have you considered writing a book about elder financial protection? Your combination of legal expertise and personal experience could help thousands of potential victims." Martha had been approached by publishers, journalists, and advocacy organizations about sharing her story. Until now, she had declined, feeling that her focus should remain on direct service to individual clients. But Patricia's suggestion had merit. The reach of a published work would far exceed anything she could accomplish through her small clinic. "I'll think about it," Martha said. After ending the call, Martha remained at the window, watching the neighborhood where she had lived for 30 years. The tree-lined streets looked the same as they had during the months when Julian was systematically dismantling her financial independence. But Martha's perspective on her environment had changed completely. She was no longer a vulnerable elderly woman waiting for the next crisis to threaten her security. She was an active participant in protecting her community from the kinds of predators who targeted age as a weakness, rather than recognizing it as a source of knowledge and experience. Martha's fingers found the worn leather of her wheelchair's armrest, but instead of feeling trapped by physical limitations, she felt empowered by the expertise that 4 decades of legal practice had given her. The brownstone around her was warm with the sound of purpose, the quiet conversations of people learning to protect themselves, the rustling of documents that would expose criminals, the voices of family members rebuilding trust that manipulation had damaged. For the first time in years, Martha looked at her name on legal documents and felt pride rather than vulnerability. Her signature represented not a target for exploitation, but a shield for protection, both for herself and for the community she served. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. Thank you for spending